Okay, we're going to go ahead and find the inverse of this particular function. It happens to be a square root function. The first thing I like to do is find the domain and range. So domain, range. Okay, again, I can use my calculator if I have to. And I'm going to go ahead and go y equals, we'll type in square root of x plus 4. X plus 4. And I'll look at a graph, and it'll look like this. And if you have trouble seeing the domain and range graphically, tables are always very helpful. And if I go up here, I'm looking, all of these values so far are great, and then I start running into issues right here. So you'll notice that the x value -4 is an okay domain. It's a value I can plug in. The math likes it. It produces a y value. And -3 works, produces a y value, and so on and so forth. And I can keep scrolling, and my numbers can keep getting larger. And you'll notice my y values keep getting larger as well. Okay, so I'm going to go back down to that -4, and I'll pull it off right here so we can look at it. All right, so you'll notice the math likes -4, and from there, all numbers that are greater, I could scroll this way forever like I just showed on my calculator. So my domain would be -4, close bracket, to positive infinity. My numbers can keep getting larger, larger, larger. The math allows it. And we know the reason it allows it is because I'm not allowed to have negatives under the radical sign. If I put in a -5 value for x right here, I would get a negative under the radical sign. If I plugged in a -6, negative for the radical sign. Okay? So only number 4, -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, all numbers greater than -4. Okay, for my range, all y values, you notice the lowest y value I get right here is 0, and then again, if I were to scroll forever, my numbers would keep getting larger. Okay? So that means my range here, the lowest y value I would get is 0. Now, later on, after we do the inverse, the reason this is important is because once I develop an inverse, these are going to switch positions. The range will become the domain, and the domain will become the range. Okay, over to the math here. I have 4 steps in order to find an inverse. Number 1, I turn it into y equals square root of x plus 4. Step 2, I'm going to flip-flop my x's and y's. X goes where the y goes where the x goes. Okay, step 3, I'm now going to solve for y. I'm going to get y all by itself on the right side of the equation. So I start off by squaring this whole thing. I get rid of the large square root symbol, and I have to do it over here. Okay, because squares and square rooting are opposite operations, so these would cancel each other out. And down here, I now have x squared equals y plus 4. And the last thing I need to do in order to get y by itself is subtract 4 from both sides. This goes away, and I get x squared minus 4 equals y. Okay, last but not least, okay, I'm going to go ahead and put it back into function notation. So we'll draw an arrow over this way, and I'm going to write it from left to right. So f inverse of x equals x squared minus 4. This is my final answer. This is an opposite formula. Okay, so for example, if I were to plug in a -4 into my original equation, if I plugged in a -4 right here, I would get -4 plus 4 is 0, and the square root of 0 is 0. And I would see it right here on the table. If I were to plug in a 0 right here, 0 squared minus 4, okay, it goes backwards. 0 squared minus 4 is negative 4. And you'll notice from this table, okay, I'm changing my inputs. Okay, in my original formula, if I plug in a negative 4, I get a 0. In my inverse, if I plug in a 0, I go back and get my original number. Okay, so domain and range. So since my original range and domain were up here, and they're going to flip-flop, this is now going to be my domain, and the top one is going to be my range, inherited from F. So if I looked at this and you said, what is the domain? I would say all real numbers. But I still have to follow the rules of the original function. The original function says for this y table over here that I can't have any numbers less than 0. So the numbers I'm plugging back into this inverse have to follow those same rules. So my domain here now is 0 to positive infinity.